cell phones if you haven't yet done so. For those of you that are new to the library, restrooms and water fountain are all on the first floor. Theoretically, there's a fire exit here. I don't know that it would be our safest exit, but if we had to, we would just toss the TV and run. Otherwise, there's 2 fire exits across from us, as well as the main entrance downstairs that you came in. Tonight, as you know, we have a very special opportunity to hear from a volunteer survivor speaker, Peter Feigl. Mr. Feibel will share with us his personal story and memories of the Holocaust. Some of you were able to watch the video. That was a presentation that I showed just to kind of get people into the mode of why we're here this evening. On this, the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camps, I just ask that we take a moment and share a moment of silence to honor the over 6 million victims of the Holocaust. As was expressed in the video, it's important to remember, and it's important to bear witness, and it's important to share and speak up, because if you don't, you could very easily be back in a similar situation, even though people say never again. That's why we're all here. Mr. Feigl will be speaking to us from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is in Washington, D.C. A very special thank you to the museum, and in particular to Carrie Bannister for her assistance in arranging for this evening's important presentation. This is done on a volunteer basis. The museum does not get any funding for this, and they do rely on funds. So that's my pitch for the museum. I encourage you all to visit their website at USHMM.org. It's right there on the screen. The site offers a wide range of resources and other witness accounts for those who wish to learn more about this tragic time in our shared history. The evening's talk will last approximately 45 minutes, after which we'll have about 10 minutes available for questions and answers. So at the end of the talk, if anyone is interested in asking a question, I think it would be easiest if you came around this side to line up, because we're going to ask you to come right up front so that Mr. Feibel can see who's asking the question and speak into the microphone. That's it on housekeeping. So please join me in a warm welcome for our speaker, Peter Feigl, and Carrie Bannister from the museum.
Thank you so much. Chris did such a great job introducing the program this evening that I'm not going to take up really any more of your time, and I'll skip straight over to Peter Feibel, but I would like to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to hear Peter talk about his experiences during the Holocaust. As you heard Chris mention, it's incredibly important, particularly around these International Holocaust Remembrance Day commemorative events, to really take a moment to learn the history of the Holocaust and share your experiences hearing this testimony with others. Unfortunately, it's a sad reality of our world that Holocaust denial still exists, so we rely very heavily on the public to hear this testimony and really share your experiences hearing from Peter with others. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Peter Feibel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, Ms. Johnson, for organizing this, especially today. It has special meaning for me because, as you will hear, both my parents were killed in Auschwitz, and so let me tell you a little bit my story. First of all, for those of you who might have doubts about how much can I possibly remember, I was born in 1929, so in another 4 weeks I'm going to turn 91 years of age. So the events that I will be relating occurred in when I was 13, 14, 15 years of age. And as you will hear, I wrote 2 contemporaneous diaries also to record everything. And they have been documented profusely since then, so I do remember. I was born in Berlin, Germany, in 1929. My father was a graduate mechanical engineer. He had Austrian citizenship and was working, you might say, as a foreigner in Germany at the time. When I was born, my mother was native German, and she automatically acquired Austrian citizenship under the laws in Europe at that time. A woman automatically acquires the citizenship of her husband, and so both my parents and I too, we were all considered Austrians in Germany. My family was what I would define as a upper middle class family. We were quite well off. My father was totally secular, wanted nothing to do with religion, and I had no exposure to any kind of religion services as a young child. So I basically had very pleasant, comfortable young years. There are some photographs that I have here. There's my father, always wearing spats, very up to just latest fashion, my mother and I. And here I'm about 3 or 4 years old in this picture here. And here's a close-up. This is my mother after she finished her education, and my father, one of his passport photographs. The age difference, by the way, was 16 years between my mother and father, something that was usual back in those days. A young man wouldn't consider getting married until such time as he was financially established and was able to provide for his wife. And usually elder men like younger women. So anyhow, here is a photograph of me in 1935. This is my first school day in Berlin. The large cone that I'm carrying is traditional in the German schools, or at least it was back then. It's filled with candy. And I was sent off to school, and this was in April of 1935, so I was 6 years old. And for the first time, my first grade reader, the title of it on the top is Der Giftpilz, which means the poisoned mushroom. And you see a picture of the mushroom. He happens to have a Jewish nose, and if that doesn't get the message, there's a Star of David on his belly. And the teacher spent considerable time teaching the class that Jews are just like the poisoned mushroom. They are people to be avoided and despised. They lie, they steal, they cheat. They are the cause of all the economic problems in Germany. And of course, as a 6-year-old and not knowing anything else about any other kind of religion, I most certainly didn't want to identify myself with those kind of people. And I had no reason really at the time to do so. And I absorbed this propagandistic message, which essentially filled me with anti-Semitism. Little did I know that subsequently I would be considered a Jew. Shortly after I finished my first year in Berlin, my father was transferred to an office of his company in Prague, Czechoslovakia. The only shock for me was that overnight I suddenly found myself in the school where I had to learn Czech. At that age, at age 7, you learn quickly. Within 6 months, I was speaking Czech. I think my father's job at the time was to close that office because it was not profitable. And subsequently, he was transferred to Vienna, which of course made him very happy. That was his hometown. One of his sisters, Marianne, was still living in Vienna. His other sister, Hermine, lived in Innsbruck, Austria. We traveled and visited them frequently. Again, at that point, in late 1937, my mother and my father had a little conversation, and they decided, Austria is 95% Catholic, Roman Catholic. They have a long tradition of anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews. Germany, which we left, Hitler is ranting and raving against the Jews. Why don't we have Peter baptized? So my father arranged for me to be baptized in the Votiv church in Vienna at the age of 8. And I, for the first time, had a religious education. Here's a picture of me in my first communion outfit. And I was very happy, and I also had an occasion to serve as an altar boy, and things seemed very good. Again, upper middle class life, I was enjoying it. In March of 1938, now I'm 9 years of age, Hitler annexed Austria, and at that point, when I heard that Hitler was coming to Vienna, we lived about a mile and a half away from the city hall. I understood that he was going to go to this town hall. So I ran away from home because 9 years old, Hitler, I had heard so much about him in Germany. I wanted to see him. And I stood in the amidst the crowd. There were hundreds of thousands of people, all of them screaming, "Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer," one people, one empire, one leader. And I actually got to see Hitler driving by. And boy, did I want to join the Hitler Youth. They had snazzy uniforms and the sand brown belt. And with the uniform, you got a dagger too now. As a 9-year-old, I really wanted that dagger. Well, I was gone for a good 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours, and when I came home, my mother was furious, and she said, "Where in the hell have you been?" And I said to her very proudly, "I saw our Führer," whereupon my mother slapped me left and right and said to me, "He is not our Führer, and don't you ever say that again." I was very confused at the time. I didn't know what it was, but within a matter of about 10 days or so, we very hastily left Vienna with just one suitcase each. Purportedly because my father had some business to take care of in Belgium, where the company also had an office. And we were extensively interrogated by the German border police. Why are you leaving the Third Reich? This is, we're now part of Germany. And my father said, "I'm not leaving. We're leaving all our furniture. Everything is at home. As you can see, we only have one suitcase each. And I'm going to be on business in Belgium." And my father was able to go like this on a moment's notice because he traveled extensively throughout Europe with visas, multiple entry business visas. So he was able to do this, and he took us along. They finally let us leave. And now we wound up in Belgium, in Brussels, in a one and a half room furnished apartment, quite a come down from the large apartment that we occupied in Vienna. And of course, for me, as a 9-year-old, I had to part with my electric train set and my toy soldiers and my stroller. I was very unhappy about that. And on top of that, I now had to learn another language because in Brussels, in the school, we were in the French-speaking part, so I had to learn French and at the same time also learn Flemish, which is sort of akin to Dutch. But again, at that age, you learn quickly, and my parents kept reassuring me because rumors were circulating that war was imminent in Europe. It was only a matter of time. And in Belgium, there was nothing to worry about because Belgium had declared its neutrality about 5 or 6 years earlier. And if a war should ever start, we are in a very good and safe place. So in no time, I got into the groove and everything was going fine. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany attacked Poland, and this was the start of the Second World War. 3 days later, the Allies, Britain and France, who had a treaty with Poland to come to its help in case of invasion, declared war on Germany. And my parents said, well, this is too bad, there's a war, but we have nothing to worry about. We are in a neutral country. And for us, life continued just as it had been before. And this illusion lasted until the 10th of May 1940, at which time Germany invaded Belgium and Holland in order to circumvent or go around the Maginot Line that was defending French territory. And at that point, my father felt an obligation to go to his office in order to pay whatever salary was due to his employees there. On the way to the office, there was a police identity check. He pulled out his German passport and was promptly arrested by the Belgian authorities, who assumed that he must be one of those undercover Nazis who had been parachuted into Belgium. It took my mother about 3 days to locate my father. He was in a military base, Belgian base. We went to see him. We were allowed to bring him a suitcase and a blanket. And my father said to my mother, look, take Peter and yourself and get out of Brussels. And by the way, take your mother along too. My grandmother was also living in Brussels at the time. And you want to get out of here. You don't want to get caught between two armies. You have the Germans coming from the northeast, and you have the French and the British coming to the aid of the Belgians from the southwest. So we promptly fled also, and we were among the hundreds of thousands of people who clogged the roads from Belgium into France. We were heading for Paris, and we periodically were being machine gunned by German Stuka dive bombers. This is 1940, I'm 11 years old, and the only thing that I could think of is that when I grow up, I want to be a pilot and sit in the cockpit of an airplane with a machine gun. That must be a lot of fun. Every time we were being attacked, we would jump into the nearest ditch, and I didn't realize that the cow that fell next to me dead was killed by one of the bullets. That didn't occur to me. I wasn't smart enough for that. But we managed, it took us about 10 days with a combination of walking, hitchhiking, to get to Paris. And when we got to Paris, where my mother's sister lived, my aunt, we were there in her apartment for less than 4 hours when the air raid sirens went off. And my mother said, well, I didn't come to Paris to be bombed. I could have stayed in Brussels and get bombed there. So mother said, we're going south. We're heading for Bordeaux, down on the southern part of France on the Atlantic coast. And with my grandmother, we headed to Bordeaux on one of the last trains that it was able to make it from Paris to the south of France. And upon arriving in Bordeaux, my mother's German upbringing clicked into, went into operation, and that is, we must conform with the law, and the law requires us to register with the police. So she went to the police and said, here I am, I would like to register and get a residence permit. And the French policeman said, now let me see, madam, I don't quite understand this. You're born in Germany, so you're a German, but you married an Austrian, so that makes you an Austrian, but there's no more Austria. And you're here with your mother and with your son, and you come from Belgium, you don't have a visum, you have no right to be in France. I don't know what to do with you. Go to the gendarmerie. The gendarmerie is the national police. The same thing occurred there. A man at the gendarmerie said, you have to go to the city, to the civilian authorities, the prefecture, which is the county or state government. And the other man said to my mother, oh, we have experts that know exactly how to deal with people such as you. And you're going to take a train and go to a place called Oloron-Sainte-Marie, and they will know what to do with you. So with the little money that my mother had, We headed down to Oloron, and there the train was surrounded by French policemen with submachine guns. They loaded us into trucks, and they dumped us into a French detention camp called Gurs. You see that on the bottom of France there, by the Spanish border, the vicinity of the Spanish border. Now, you have to understand that the war is still going on. France has not yet surrendered. So as far as the French are concerned, we have a German passport, and we are enemy aliens at this stage. Now, the Gurs camp had been created about 2 years earlier, in 1938, and the purpose of it was to hold refugees from the Spanish Civil War. Gurs was a camp with a capacity of about 14,000 people. There were 60 people in each barrack. There were no cots or beds. You slept on the floor. And the floor was strewn with straw, which was replaced once a week. Food was next to non-existent. For breakfast, you had some lukewarm dark fluid, which was called coffee, and you got one slice of bread with that. For lunch, you got another lukewarm fluid. If you happen to have a couple of slices of carrot floating in it, you hit the jackpot. You had some vegetable in your soup, and you got another slice of bread. And dinner was pretty much a repeat of lunch. Although there were no beds, we had bed bugs, we had body lice, we had fleas. Interestingly enough, the barracks themselves had no washing facilities, no toilets. There was a cold water spigot on the outside of the barrack, and that was where you had to wash. And the toilets, called latrines, were located about 150 yards or so away from the barracks. There was no paved walkway or anything. It rained a lot. You had mud up to your ankles going to the latrines, and they essentially were open pits with just a board and holes on them. And well, this is now the latter part of May in the south of France. It's very warm. France is famous for its perfumes. That ain't the place where they made them. So my mother was lucky. She was appointed as barracks chief. And as barracks chief, she was able to get periodic briefings about once every 5-6 days. The camp commander would call the barracks chiefs together and tell them what was going on the outside world, because we were totally cut off. We didn't have newspapers. There was no radio. The only news, if you can call it that was available came from new prisoners who came in almost daily. And as you can imagine, in this kind of a situation, rumors are running absolutely wild, and people, the adults, were going out of their mind, crazy. What is really happening? Are the Germans advancing or not? Are we in danger? No one knew. Until about the 20th of June, when France surrendered and signed an armistice with the Germans. Under that armistice, several things happened. Number one, France was divided into an occupied zone, the northern part, with Paris as its capital, and that was run by the Germans, occupation forces. And the southern part, called the so-called unoccupied zone, was to be led by a hero of a French hero of the First World War, Marshal Pétain, who established the capital of this unoccupied zone in a spa city called Vichy. So you may have heard it referred to as Vichy, France. And he appointed as his prime minister a man named Pierre Laval. Laval was a well-known anti-Semite. He was the publisher of an anti-Jewish newspaper in France. And with the approval of Pétain, they, in short order, published some anti-Jewish legislation that was even more restrictive than the Nuremberg laws that Hitler had established back in 1934. In effect, throwing out Jews from any job, any position in universities, management, ownership of large companies, and so forth. So we couldn't wait to see what was happening next. We feared that the Germans might come in to select Jews, because also part of the armistice agreement, there was a clause that required the French to turn over to Germany any non-French citizen that the Germans wanted claimed that they wanted to have turned over to them. So when my mother learned that a German army inspection team was about to come to the camp to look for German citizens, non-Jews, who were held as enemy aliens by the French, my mother decided that she was going to get us out of there. She stood at the entrance of the camp, and as the German officer arrived, she rushed forwards toward him with her passport in her hand, shoved it under his nose, yelled "Heil Hitler," and said, "I am a citizen of the Third Reich. I have been held here in this stinking hellhole by these no good, lousy, dirty Frenchmen. I demand to be released immediately with my mother and with my son." And the officer looked at the passport and turned to the camp commander and said, "You call a taxi for Madame. You pay taxi. Taxi takes Madame wherever she wants to go." And 20 minutes later, we were sitting in a cab. And the cab driver said, "Where to, Madame?" And my mother says, "Take us to Spain." And he said, "That's impossible. The Spaniards will not allow anyone in, and the French and the Germans won't allow anybody else." "Well, where can you take us?" "Well, I can take you north, so start driving." So the cab driver drove. We drove for several hours, came through the town of Toulouse, one of the larger cities in France, where my grandmother had apparently found out that her other daughter, the aunt who was in Paris, had managed to get to Toulouse. And my grandmother said to my mother, "Look, you've got your hands full with Peter. I'm going to join Annelie, your sister, and make it a little easier for you." So we continued on north until we came to a town called Osh, and there people warned us not to go any further, that the Germans weren't far away from on the other side of the city. And so now my mother knocked on the door of a large brick building. It turned out to be a Catholic convent. She explained her situation, and the nun said to my mother, "I will help you." And this is the first time that we ran into someone who extended their hospitality and their kindness to someone, to a refugee who needed help. The nun put my mother in touch with a food distribution center in Osh. The center was operated jointly by the Swiss Red Cross and the American Quakers. They agreed to hire my mother, give her a part-time job. And with a part-time job, she was able to go to the police, register, get a residence permit to stay in the town. And we wound up in a one-room apartment, which really was one room. It was kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, living room. It was all in one room. But mother and I were together. Mother was able to bring home some food almost daily from the food distribution center. And my mother actively endeavored to locate my father. We had no idea what had happened to him. And by the way, this is the food distribution center. My mother is the third person from the right in that center. And she finally located him and found out that my father was in the same Gils camp in which we had been. Of course, we didn't know that at that time. My father, as I mentioned, was 16 years older than my mother. He was 54 years old then. Under the severe conditions that prevailed in the camp, he had developed heart trouble. And by March of 1941, he was given a convalescence leave, a 30-day convalescence leave, and was able to join us. and my mother was able to get the leave renewed on a monthly basis. Of course, as I mentioned before, under the Vichy anti-Jewish laws, my father was prohibited from doing any work. He felt very bad about this because he felt that as the man of the family, he should be bringing home money and support his wife and his child. But anyhow, we managed, and there were efforts made to get visas to come to the United States. At one point, my father did get his immigration visa to the US, and he refused to leave until such time as my mother and I got our visa. By the time my mother and I got a visa, his visa had expired. It was a catch-22 situation. So the time went on. In 1942, in the summer of 1942, rumors are circulating now in the south of France that there was a roundup of Jews taking place in the occupied zone. In Paris, there was the infamous Veldiv roundup of some 12,000 Jews, I believe, that were held for several days without food and water in what was a sporting arena, a bicycle racing arena in Paris. And the rumors were that many of the Jews were being sent east for resettlement. No one really quite knew what that meant, but it was a scary situation. I heard my parents whisper about it. But in July 42, when the school finished, the summer vacation started, my mother was able to get me into a Quaker-run camp, summer camp, in a town called Condon, about 20 miles or so away from Osh. And well, I'm 13, happy-go-lucky. It's a Quaker camp, American camp, food. There'll be plenty to eat there, and there'll be other kids. So I was happy to go there. And suddenly, in the middle of August, around the 14th, 15th of August, my father suddenly appeared. He had ridden his bicycle. I was astounded that he could cover 20 miles on his bicycle with the heart trouble that he had. And he came to give me a small pouch and told me not to, I wanted to look at it. He said, no, just put it in your pocket. This is something for you to keep. And he said he had to get back to Osh before sundown because under the Vichy laws, Jews were not allowed to be on the street after sundown. And we were on the crest of a hill, and as he climbed on his bicycle and disappeared from my view, I feared that somehow I don't think I'll ever see my father again. And a few days later, on the 27th of August, the director of that summer camp, a devout Catholic lady who had taken me to 7 o'clock Mass almost every day, called me into her office and told me that I'm very sorry, Pierre, but I just learned that your parents were arrested yesterday in Osh. We don't really know where they are, what happened to them, but don't worry, I'm going to organize a novena. And at the end of the 9 days of prayers, I am sure that your parents will be restored to you. So on that very day, on the 27th of August, I started a diary, and I recorded on a daily basis what was happening to me. Because I was convinced that I would be seeing my parents again before too long. And I wanted them to know that I was a good boy and did everything that they would have expected of me. And about 4 days later, Mrs. Cavallon suddenly appeared and said, Peter, you look sick, very sick. I want you to go to bed right away. And I said, I'm not sick. Shut up, go to bed right now. And she gave me a potion to drink, and about 20-30 minutes later, 2 French gendarmes came. They examined me, they took my temperature, and they said, yes, oui, Madame Cavallon, we can see that the child is sick. He is too sick to be moved, but we will be back. We have orders here to arrest him and take him with us. So At this point, Mrs. Cavaillon had come to the well, I should add here, Mrs. Cavaillon apparently had been warned by someone at the gendarmerie station that they were going to come to arrest me. So here again is someone who not only put his job on the line, but that policeman put his life on the line, because anyone who helps Jews escape was subject to execution under the Vichy laws. So again, I was very lucky. Mrs. Cavaillon and I now wrote to the Quakers and said, please, I've got this Jewish child on my hand. You've got to help me and take him, because the police are going to come back to arrest him. The Quakers wrote to her and said, we're very fortunate. We've just received permission from the Vichy government to send 500 orphans to America. The ship will be leaving at the end of November. Have Peter fill out these forms. So I filled out the forms, name, date of birth, place of birth, religion. I put down Catholic. A few days later, Mrs. Cavaillon gets a letter from the Quakers and said, Mrs. Cavaillon, you don't understand. We're trying to save some Jewish children. Mrs. Cavaillon wrote back to the Quakers. And by the way, this is all documented. I've been able to get copies of all of this correspondence. So she's writing a 4-page letter back to the Quakers saying, no, you don't understand. When the gendarmes come here and I show them his baptismal certificate, they say it's a worthless piece of paper as far as the Vichy government is concerned. This boy is part of the Jewish race and we are arresting him. So please reconsider. Well, the Quakers reconsidered. The gendarmes came one more time to arrest me. Then, since I was allowed to be part of that transport, the prefecture ordered the police to lay off and leave me alone. I'll be leaving the country before too long. In the early March, on early September, on the 6th of September, Mrs. Cavaillon escorted me on the train and took me to Marseille, turned me over to the Quakers. She took her 4-year-old daughter with her. She was a little cute little girl with curly blonde hair and blue eyes. And she said, I'm taking my daughter along. That way, we are less likely to be interrogated by police, or for identity checks, we look more like a normal family. So I was turned over to the Quakers. And on the 10th of September, the Allies, the Americans, British, Canadians, and Australians landed in North Africa. Now, this was the excuse, if the Nazis needed one, for them to occupy the unoccupied zone, march in. And the very first thing that they did is they ordered all ship traffic in and out of Marseille to be stopped. By the way, this picture, the apartment above the entrance door is that one-room apartment that we had in Auschwitz, where I was there. This was a summer camp in 1941. They put on a play, The Emperor Has No Clothes, and I'll come to this one in a little while. So I'm now in Marseille, and the first thing that the Germans did is they order all ship traffic in and out of Marseille to be stopped, no ships. In my diary, there's an entry, Goodbye America, because I realized that I will never make it. I was then bounced from one orphanage to another while they were trying to figure out what are we going to do with Peter. And in January, rumors began to circulate in Marseille that the Germans and the French were about to round up all the Jews in Marseille. So they had to find shelter for me, and apparently the Quakers were in contact with a Protestant minister in the village of Le Chambon, Pastor André Trocmé, and he said, yes, go ahead, I'll take Peter in. And sometime around the 10th or 12th of January, I was put on a train, given instructions where to get off, and I arrived at 1 o'clock in the morning. It's all described in my diary, and met by this fellow Daniel Trocmé. I had no idea who he was. He was the cousin of the pastor of the village. And this was at the elevation of about 3,000 feet. The roads were covered in ice. It was very, very cold, middle of the night. He took me, we hiked for about 1.5 miles, 2 miles, until I fell into bed. And the next morning I tried to orient myself, just where am I, what is this? And I learned that I was in a village of Le Chambon, which is 95% Protestant in essentially Catholic France. France is also about 90-95% Catholic. The inhabitants of this village and the surrounding area are known as Huguenots in America. The Huguenots were persecuted by the Catholics back in the 16th century, and they know what it means to be persecuted for their their beliefs and their religion. There was an infamous massacre, the St. Bartholomew massacre in Paris, where in one night some 10,000 Protestants were slaughtered by Catholics. So some of the Protestants managed to find refuge in this inhospitable plateau at the higher elevation, and the people, the soldiers pursuing them, figured out that they can't survive up there anyhow. But they formed a solid community. Interesting, all told, there were some 5,000 villagers, and of those 5,000, they saved about 5,000 refugees, of whom about 3,000 were Jewish, and many of them were children, and I was one of them. Interestingly enough, there was a documentary made about this village many years later, back in the 1980s, and I happened to be also in that documentary. But the producer of the film is interviewing a lady, an elderly lady, who is shuffling towards her temple, their Protestant church, and she's clutching the Bible in the crook of her arm. And he says, "Tell me, madame, why did you do this? Why did you save these people? It was against the law. You could have been killed, executed. You could have had your property taken from you. You could have sold whatever agricultural products you had. You could have sold them on the black market and enriched yourself." And she says, "Because it's in the book. It says that if someone is sick, you go to their bedside and you bring them cheer. If someone is hungry, you ask them to table and you share what food you have. If someone needs shelter, you open your door and you admit them and to provide shelter." So they felt that they were doing the right thing, what was expected, what the Bible asked them to do. And they really lived it. The photograph that you see is the tallest man there in the middle is Daniel Trocmé again. He was the director of the home where I was. The home is the building in the back of it. And I'm in that circle there. And all of the kids in the front are refugees. Some of them were like me, German Jewish children. Some of them were Spanish refugees. Some were from Czechoslovakia, and so forth. So we were about 24 kids there. And they tried to take good care, as good as they could, as well as they could with us. And they had created classrooms. They were sort of makeshift classrooms in farmhouses where there was an empty room or something, and they tried to see to it that we also continue to our education. So in September of 1943, other interesting thing is on several occasions, for instance, the police came into the village and they were looking for Jews, and whenever that happened, the pastor, Trocmé, would be tipped off in advance, and word would circulate around, and our teachers would suddenly break the class and say, we're going to go out and pick mushrooms. And well, mushrooms don't grow in May or April or June. Mushrooms grow in October, November. But anyhow, they tried to shield us from worry and made us believe we were going to go look for mushrooms. And then once the police left the village, then they got us back into class. So, September of 1943, I was one of those selected by the people manufacturing false identities. Those of us who could pass as Frenchmen were given false identities, and in order to help us with our education, we were sent to a cooperating high school in another town called Figeac. And for these false identity papers, they took passport photographs of us. That's my passport photograph. And somehow we were given 4 or 5 extra pictures, which we then exchanged among our friends as we were leaving the town. And I wrote on the back of each photograph against instructions. We were specifically told not to take any photographs or any compromising information with us. I wrote on the back of each of the pictures that I had the real name and the false name of the people. This one here is Paul Fogelman, was his real name. His French name, false name, was Paul Feigl. And as a matter of fact, he survived. I'll tell you later about that. He still lives in New Jersey today. Anyhow, I should also mention that at the end of January, on the 31st of January, when my first diary ends abruptly, it was Daniel Trockme who discovered that I was writing in a book, and he asked to see it. When he saw the diary, he said, "No, you can't. I've got to take that from you because it contains too many names and addresses of people that would, if it falls into the hands of the police, it would be too dangerous for them." Meantime, of course, I'm still worrying what has happened to my parents. There was no information, only that sometime at the beginning of September, they were in Paris in an area somewhere, and that they were being sent east for resettlement again. So I'm now sent to Figeac, and this is a French high school, a boarding school. Again, there were 4 of us sent from, 5 of us, excuse me, 5 of us that were sent from Le Chambon to Figeac. And I tried to keep away from the others. I went to the adjacent church in order to maintain the pretense that I was not one of them. And I always wondered, there must have been at least one of the principals or teachers in the school who knew very well that we were not Frenchmen, because 2 of the boys looked Jewish, and they spoke with a Jewish accent. So move the clock forward now, in May of 1944, I'm 15 and a half at this point. An SS division, das Reich, walks into Figeac and orders all the males between the ages of 54 and 16 and 54 to report for assignment to a hard labor detachment. Well, even though I wasn't 16 yet, I had gotten a lot smarter over the years, and I knew that the best thing was to disappear, make myself go undercover. And since I knew my way into the adjacent Catholic church, I climbed into the church steeple and spent the next 24 hours up there. From up there, I could see the town hall and watch the men being loaded onto trucks. I came down the next morning after the trucks left, and at that point I was contacted by some Jewish underground organization, and they told me, "Look, it's too dangerous for you to remain here. We're going to help you to escape. Just stand by, be ready to leave on a moment's notice." And by the way, on the 1st of January of 1944, while I was in Figeac under false identity, I began writing my second diary. Again, a contemporaneous daily record of what I was doing and what was happening in the area. So on the 22nd of May of 1944, excuse me, on the 26th or 27th of May, I got instructions from the Jewish underground to take a train, where to get off, wait for passeurs. So these are guides who, for money, will tell you how to cross the border illegally, when to cross, and so forth. And I, together with a group of about 20 other kids, got off the train near the Swiss border. Again, in my diary, I described the conditions, the weather conditions. That's the church steeple where I hid there for 24 hours. Here is in my diary. It was on Monday, the 22nd of May, that took the train at 6:30 in the morning in Lyon. And this is the sketch of the border. So when the guards were changed at the border, they blow a whistle, and at that point, while the guards are busy, we climbed over the first barbed wire fence on the French side, crossed the no man's land, and then the barbed wire fence on the Swiss side. And there, a Swiss border guard ordered me behind this building. There was a garden back there. And after he collected all of those of us who had crossed the border, we were put on a truck and taken prisoner and taken to a Swiss triage center, where they interrogated us and would decide what to do with us. On the way to interrogation, someone warned me and said, be very careful. The Swiss are sending the Jews right back into the waiting hands of the French police. So when I was interrogated, I pulled out my baptismal certificate, which had been sewn into the lining of my jacket. And when I showed that to the Swiss policeman, he said, "Ah, Monsieur Catholique, bienvenue en Suisse. You're a Catholic. Welcome to Switzerland." So for me, I was safe. The war ended at that point. And in my diary, I entered, "I now sleep in peace in a free country." The Swiss, my father had given me the name of a Swiss business associate of his. He agreed to take me into his family. I spent the next 2 years in Switzerland, while my uncle, my aunt, and my grandmother had made it to the United States in 1941. They then sponsored me to come to the States. And ultimately in 1946, July of 1946, I arrived in the United States. I was 17 and a half then. And I also learned about my parents' fate, indirectly, if you will, when on the 27th or on the 28th of January of 1945, as the Soviet troops entered into Auschwitz, the stories were reported in the Swiss newspapers. And at that point, I had to reluctantly consider that, unfortunately, that probably is what had happened to my parents. It took many years later. It wasn't until 1992 that I actually had documentary proof that my parents indeed were sent from Auschwitz first to a collection camp called Vernet. Then they were sent to Drancy, which is in a suburb of Paris, and that was the assembly point of the transports that went from France to Auschwitz. I then discovered in those documents that my parents were on transport convoy number 28. There's their name entered on the list. Each convoy had 1,000 human beings on board, give or take 4 or 5. These lists in alphabetical order were given to the German non-commissioned officer who was in charge of the transports. The transport arrived 4 days later 2 days later in Auschwitz. It left Paris on the 4th of September, arrived in Auschwitz on the 6th of September, and my parents were gassed and killed in Auschwitz shortly after they arrived there. So the picture that you saw before here This is my mugshot from the Swiss police after they arrested me. So that pretty much tells my story. In the United States, I had a very good life. I got married in 1954. My wife and I got into the aircraft industry. I did become a pilot, got a pilot's license. I had a very checkered career and traveled all over the world on business, selling airplanes, helicopters. I did a 5.5-year stint in the Defense Department as a senior negotiator for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I also had served 3 years in the Air Force, and my wife and I moved to Florida in retirement in 1990. That's when I became involved in the Holocaust, first because at that point Florida mandated the teaching of the Holocaust, and also through I had with me that second diary when I went over the barbed wire fence into Switzerland. I never was sure what happened to my first diary until the documentary of Le Chambon was shown in French movie theaters in 1987. And at that point, I received a letter from a man in Paris asking whether I was the Pierre Feigl who had written a diary dedicated to his parents. I first thought this was some sort of a scam. Anyhow, I went to see the man in Paris. Sure enough, he had my first diary. Where did you get my diary? Well, he said, I'm a collector of such artifacts. I bought it about 2 years after the war on a flea market on the Côte d'Azur in Nice. And I published your diary in France because I thought that you had been killed. And now I wanted my diary back. He was pleading that he was a poor man. He needed money. So I had to pay him $265 to get my diary back. Anyhow, that first diary, which I recovered 40 years after having lost it, and my second diary, both I donated them to the Holocaust Museum. They are here in Washington, and they have been published in a book entitled Salvage Pages, put together by Alexandra Zapruder. It might be available in your library there. And also, you can also, if you're interested, read my diaries online. That the Holocaust Museum has them available on its line, as well as the Spielberg Foundation. Because of my having appeared in a number of documentaries, including one that the British Broadcasting Corporation did, and in a number of books, there were other books written about Le Chambon and about me. My wife used to refer to me as the Brad Pitt of the Holocaust. So anyhow, I want to thank you very much for having listened to me, and I'm very grateful to you for your interest in this. I am at your disposal to answer any questions that you might have. And again, I thank you very much, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Are there any questions? No? Can you hear me, Peter?
Yes, I can hear you.
Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to come up? Come on up.
Usually okay, all right.
This really isn't a question about you. I just want to know, have you by any chance crossed paths with a Paul Salmon?
Have you crossed paths with a Paul Salmon?
Fogelman, yeah, Paul Fogelman, yes.
No.
S-A-L-M-O-N?
S-A-L-M-O-N. A Paul Salmon.
No, I don't think so.
No, all right.
No.
I went on a Holocaust tour last October.
Yes.
He was a tour guide. He lives in London, but he also is a museum curator at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So
I see.
Your paths had crossed. Paul
we survivors are dying off almost daily these days, but at one point there were several thousand survivors, I guess, and so, but I don't recall ever having met him, no. Although I lived for 3 years in London also in the 1980s, so, yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Actually, I have two questions. I'm curious as to your level of understanding of what was happening when you were going through all of this as a young boy.
Very good question. And quite honestly, I really was not someone who delved extensively in what was going on. I lived from day to day. In part, it was conditioned on the fact that I was an only child. I had no relatives after my parents were arrested. So I had to pretty much rely on the people that were caring for me. We all during those days in the south of France suffered from malnutrition. Food was rationed, but even with ration tickets, that didn't mean that the food was available. And I certainly lived pretty much from day to day. I also either developed at that time, or maybe this is part of the genes. I am not someone who worries about things. I think AA has a prayer that says something like, God, give me the strength to make the difference between the things that I can change and things I cannot change. And I pretty much said, worrying about it isn't going to make it any better or any worse. And I sort of took things on a day-to-day basis as they came.
Wow, that's very interesting. The other thing I often think about or wonder about is what German children are taught in school about the Holocaust today, or in recent history. Do you have any insight into that?
Good. Another very good question. I cannot speak firsthand, but from what I've read and from what I've heard from other people, in the early years after the war, the thing was kept quiet. People didn't want to talk about it, okay? And especially in what was East Germany, the so-called Democratic Republic of Germany. They all took the position there in East Germany that we're all good communists, and we communists didn't have anything to do with this, okay? Although they were all Nazis, okay, and they suddenly became communists. But I understand that in the last 25 years or 30 years, I would say, there's been a big shift, and they are being taught extensively. There are, I think, many Germans, and this is something that I don't even understand. I've often questioned what makes a 15 or a 14, 15, 16-year-old German, why should he feel guilty about what his grandparents might or might not have done, okay? I don't share that, but I have met some of these young Germans come and spend time at the museum here. They're volunteers at the Holocaust Museum here. The other thing is that it's almost impossible to escape the history of the Holocaust in Germany today. My wife and I took an extensive 4-month trip to Europe back in 1992, and we were sort of looking for graffiti of swastikas or anti-Semitic writings and so forth. And in 4 months, we found one single instance of it. Most of the graffiti that we found said things like, we are all refugees, we are all human beings. We were astounded. And wherever you go, there are commemorative stones in the pavement. Here lived Mr. So-and-so and Mrs. So-and-so. They were arrested and deported and killed in Auschwitz or killed in Dachau and so forth. smack in Berlin, back then in 1992, coming out of a subway station, metro station in the middle of the city, there was a big sign as you emerged that said, "Places never to be forgotten." And it mentioned all of the concentration camps, all of the death camps were listed there. And today, right on one side of the Brandenburg Gate, which is about the most expensive piece of real estate in all of Germany, is a huge memorial. I think it covers something like 30 or 40 acres, I believe, with several hundred concrete blocks of various sizes as a memorial of the death camps and so forth. So yes, today definitely they are being taught in schools, and Angela Merkel has been also very instrumental in doing this. By the way, it's, for instance, it's against the law, it's punishable by imprisonment and fines in Germany to yell Heil Hitler, or to do a swastika, or to wear a Nazi uniform. So
Really?
it's
Fascinating. Thank you.
you're very welcome. It might interest you. Most of the time I speak to young students, and I generally end up by saying, okay, so many of you are probably wondering, what relevance does my story have to you? And I put it to them this way: there isn't anybody in this room who has not either been a bully, watched somebody being bullied, or was the bully itself, okay? And what I'm telling you is that I had to be taught to hate, because whenever a baby is born, a baby does not come with a brain filled with hatred. Hatred is something that you acquire. Now, you might be, as a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, hear your parents or their friends visiting speak in a derogatory fashion about people of a different nationality, with a foreign accent or whatever, or different skin color and so forth. That's how you acquire hatred. And what I'm saying to you is that I was taught to hate Jews, in fact. And if you don't stop it, the next time that you see bullying going on, you must stand up and stop it right there in its tracks. Why? I'll give you 2 good reasons. First of all, because it is the right thing to do, and everybody knows the difference between right and wrong. But if that's not enough for you, I'll give you a second one, and that's called self-preservation. You never know if you find yourself in a situation where you are part of the scapegoat of the minority. It's usually a minority, just like the guy that's being bullied is the little guy or part of a small group, because they have red hair or freckles, or they're overweight or underweight, or they speak with a foreign accent, or their skin color. And that's the other reason why you should stop it. There was a famous Protestant minister in Germany who started off supporting Hitler, but subsequently he spoke up against him, and he was arrested, but he survived the war. That was Pastor Niemöller. And when he came out of the concentration camps after the war, he put it in a very good way. He said, when they came to arrest the Unionists, I kept quiet because I'm not a union member. When they came to arrest the Socialists, I kept quiet. For the Communists, I'm not a communist, I kept quiet. When they came for the Jews, that didn't concern me. And when they came to arrest me, there was no one left to speak up on my behalf. So that is the rest. Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
Well, you actually opened it up for me. You said that you were taught to hate Jews, and here you are, a secular Jew, being raised as a secular Jew. What did you do with your religious ideation? Did you reject being Jewish when you were finally allowed to choose and choose freely? Did you go back to Catholicism? What'd you do?
Okay, you're all adults, so I will speak with adults. In school, I tell young students I'm still seeking the truth. I haven't found it yet. I also mentioned to you that in my working career, I traveled all over the world. I've been to 67 countries. I have seen Buddhists, and I have seen Muslims, and I have seen Hindus, and I have Shintos. I've been all over the world. And at one point, I thought I wanted to become a Buddhist because I thought Buddhists were very, very tolerant. I found that a Buddhist priest is not supposed to go out with girls, but if he does, Mai Pen Rai. He shouldn't play chess. If he does, Mai Pen Rai. What does Mai Pen Rai mean? It means it's not that important. So I thought this is the religion for me. But today I find that Buddhists can be just as hateful. Look at what's going on in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. You have 1 million Rohingyas who are being persecuted. So I'm afraid that I have a problem with the great majority, if not with all organized religions. An exception are the Quakers. There are only about 350 Quakers in the world. They're a very, very small number. But the amount of good that they do is totally, totally disproportionate to their numbers. And so my wife and I, we've attended Quaker meetings. I like the idea of not having someone, an intermediary between me and God, okay? I can speak to him directly if I feel like it and when I feel like it. And the idea of sitting in total silence for an hour and just reflecting, thinking quietly, and someone is moved to say something, they rise and they speak, and they get it off their chest, and someone else might stand up and say, I agree with you. I want to also help these people. Or they may be on a totally different side. I like that concept. I tried to find out what the hierarchy is among the Quakers. And I found we have no hierarchy, okay? And I like that concept also, but having been raised as a Catholic, to me, there's the Pope at the top, and then the cardinals, and it's all down the line. But apparently, what Quakers decide to do, it's an individual who is moved to do something. And any individual who wants to, can do a lot of good. So to answer your question, I haven't found any organized religion that I want to join. So
Thank you for your
you're
openness.
welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you again. We really appreciate your time and sharing your story with us. And any words of advice before we let you go? How can we keep the word going?
Well, I'd like to say two things. First of all, I understand that you have made a donation to the Holocaust Museum in my name, and I want to thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that.
It's from the library trustees. Yep.
The museum needs support, and the only word that I have is beware of politics, beware of politicians, and learn to read between the lines. Those people who did the right thing during the Hitler days were taught to read between the lines because the government controlled the press. And be careful following the man or the person that comes and tells you whatever problems we have, they're all the fault of so-and-so. They are the ones who are causing all these problems, and follow me and I will solve all your problems. Don't ask questions, just follow my directions. That's very dangerous. So long live liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We have it in this country, in our Constitution, and I hope it remains in force.
Right.
And I thank you very much for listening to me.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And Chris, just as a side note, the video video conference was recorded. I'll share it with you so that you can share it with individuals who were unable to attend the program tonight.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you.